Peptide fans, it's time for a quick reality check. BPC-157 and several other substances that were reviewed on Thursday the 23rd are not FDA approved, no matter what your Instagram feed says. Reddit thinks that things were legalized overnight, but FDA rulemaking moves slower than the line at your local DMV. Welcome to sammillerscience, where you're joining me nearly 2 decades into my personal journey to bridge the gap between macros, metabolism, muscle, and medicine. If you're joining me, thanks for trusting me to elevate your health and realize your true potential. Each week and inside every episode, I'll be sharing methods and models from my coaching journey and my personal experience, as well as the science that you need to achieve whatever specific goals you're working on in your life. Let's jump in to today's show. I'm going to walk you through what the 8 to 6 to 1 vote actually did for BPC, what category 1 is, and what it actually means in terms of where you can actually get this stuff over the next 12 to 24 months. Now, the FDA's own review staff went into last week's advisory committee meeting recommending against all 7 peptides that were listed on the agenda. The committee voted to recommend 6 of them anyways, in spite of those scientists' recommendations. Now, BPC-157 cleared 8 to 6 with 1 abstention. KPV and TB-500 landed at the same 8 to 6 to 1. MOTS-c was a little bit closer at 7 to 5 with 2 abstentions. And then on the second day, Ipamorelin passed 7 to 4 and Cmax passed 8 to 5. And then delta sleep-inducing peptide, which most people know as DSIP, was the only one to fail with a vote of 6 to 7. That was Thursday and Friday, July 23rd and 24th at the FDA's White Oak campus in Silver Spring, Maryland. The meeting was live streamed, so every one of those roll calls happened on camera. The staff position was published beforehand, so every yes vote was cast knowing the agency's own reviewers had already said no. Now, if you're a little bit newer to the peptide scene, I'm going to do a quick review breaking these down, and then we're going to get straight into the news around what this means from a legal perspective. BPC-157 is a synthetic fragment of a protein found in gastric juice taken for tendon and ligament recovery, soft tissue injury, and gut lining repair. It's by a wide margin the most requested peptide in the group. TB-500 comes out of thymosin beta-4. It binds actin and runs through most of the wound healing literature, which is why people tend to reach for it after an injury when they want muscle recovery and range of motion back. Now, KPV is 3 amino acids clipped out of alpha MSH with anti-inflammatory signaling behind it. And most people are interested in this because of gut inflammation, the immune system, and even for their skin. Your mitochondria encode MOTS-c directly, which puts it in a small category of peptides for mitochondrial health. And the research on it covers everything from metabolic regulation, insulin sensitivity, and exercise capacity. Cmax gets used for cognition. Ipamorelin shows up in anti-aging protocols, and delta sleep-inducing peptide, as the name implies, is for sleep. Now, when we think about why there's such demand for these compounds, whether it's people with a nagging shoulder injury, poor sleep, reaching for DSIP, or a metabolism that maybe people are looking to enhance with something like MOTS-c, or someone has labs come back and wants further optimization, people have started looking into the peptide market, and it has grown for over a decade without much regulatory framework around it. Now, the FDA did not review these compounds for the reasons that people are taking them. So, for example, the agency originally evaluated BPC-157 for ulcerative colitis, KPV for wound healing and inflammatory conditions, TB-500 for wound healing, and MOTS-c for obesity and osteoporosis. And then delta sleep-inducing peptide was originally looked at for opioid withdrawal and chronic insomnia, as well as narcolepsy. Cmax was looked at for cerebral ischemia and migraine, as well as trigeminal neuralgia, and Ipamorelin for insomnia. Now, almost nobody buying BPC-157 is using it for ulcerative colitis. The nominations got written around the conditions where there was the most published literature, not necessarily the conditions driving the demand on the gray market or in compounding pharmacies. So the committee spent 2 days assessing the evidence for uses that have little to do with why your client or maybe even you are actually injecting it. This sort of mismatch between what they had in terms of research and evidence and what's actually happening in the real world is part of why some of the effectiveness criteria went poorly for these 7 compounds. Now, there were still some positive votes for sure, but a lot of the scrutiny comes from the mismatch in the human research between the actual use applications. Now, a little bit on Section 503A, because this is important to understand. This covers traditional compounding, where a state-licensed pharmacist or physician makes a drug for one identified patient on a single prescription. A compounder can only use a bulk substance if it has a USP or national formulary monograph. This is a component of FDA-approved drug or appears on FDA's 503A bulks list. Now, none of these 7 peptides has a monograph, and none of them are a component of an approved drug, which leaves the bulk list as the only legal route. The PCAC runs 4 criteria on each substance: whether it's well characterized, whether it has a history of use and compounding, what the evidence says about the effectiveness, and what the safety concerns are. Now, FDA reviewers ran all 7 of these peptides through that framework and said no to every one. Peptides are sensitive to pH, temperature, concentration, and process-related impurities, and that sensitivity drives aggregation and degradation of the compound. Aggregates and peptide impurities are what raise immunogenicity risk, meaning the immune system mounts a response against the peptide itself, and injectable routes carry more of that risk than other routes like oral, for example. Delta sleep-inducing peptide actually had the longest stint of human research in the group, so trials date back to 1981. Every human study that FDA could locate used intravenous administration, and since the nomination was for subcutaneous injection, there was no effectiveness data for the route under review, because with compounding, they're basically proposing that individuals would administer this subcutaneously. The insomnia trials ran between 6 and 16 subjects, and the 2 better controlled ones came back with weak or non-significant results. So 4 decades of published work, and it still actually was one of the few peptides that didn't get the nudge from this particular committee when they voted yes on everything else. Now, the members voting yes built their case on access. Now, part of this is what's called the gray market guardrail argument. People are already injecting these compounds worldwide in significant volumes. Keeping them off of the 503A list does not change that. It only changes where people are buying them and sourcing them from, right? Because there's widespread accessibility on things like research chemical sites. So right now, that means that research use only vials from online vendors are a primary source, and people are sourcing raw material overseas. Sterility is not guaranteed, although this can vary significantly. There are some better research chemical companies versus others that may have endotoxins and LPS. So with research, there's no requirement to identify which form of peptides in the vial. There's no adverse event reporting system. You can even have changes in the quality and cleanliness of the glass that these powders are put into, even if the powder COA and HPLC looks good. So this isn't to say that research is all bad. It's just to say that there's a variance in the quality depending on where individuals are sourcing the compound. Whereas a 503A pharmacy is a state licensed facility and subject to inspection. The bulk substance has to arrive with a valid certificate of analysis and has to come from a facility registered with the FDA under Section 510 of the Act. It gets compounded to fill a prescription for one identified patient, which puts a prescriber in the loop, making a dosing decision and then carrying the liability for it, their medical license. This committee was also not asked whether these peptides work well enough to be approved as drugs. It was basically just asking whether they belong on a list of substances that a pharmacist is permitted to compound. Those are 2 completely different legal standards, and at least one member said so on record, framing the duty as applying the 503A criteria rather than the standard used for new drug applications. Approval requires demonstrated efficacy. Compounding eligibility weighs characterization, historical use, evidence, and safety together, and no single one of those is decisive on its own. So the members who voted no argued that the distinction is lost on patients. So adding a substance to a federal list signals that it cleared a bar, and none of these cleared the bar that people will assume that they cleared. Others raised enforcement capacity and the fact that some of the overseas facilities moving into peptide manufacturing have regulatory records that should worry anyone injecting these products. Now, none of this changes what a pharmacy can legally make today. I think that's an important distinction about what happened with this advisory committee meeting. The advisory committees give non-binding advice, and the FDA is not required to follow it. And then the state medical boards still have their own guidelines as well. For BPC-157 to be officially added, the FDA has to write a proposed rule, open a comment window that typically runs 60 to 90 days, work through the comments, and then publish a final rule, which 12 to 24 months is realistic in terms of the timeline, and the record supports the longer end of this, meaning traditionally government stuff is pretty slow. The FDA proposed a rule in September 2019 covering more than 30 substances. 7 years later, and the agency's own page still describes it as awaiting final regulation. Now, there's still a little bit of hope and a door that was cracked open because FDA maintains an interim policy with three categories. Category 1 means the agency does not intend to act against a compounder for using that substance while this rulemaking period plays out. Coming off of Category 2 does not automatically put a compound into Category 1. It basically moves them into an evaluation phase. So that is what this July Advisory Committee meeting was all about. If the FDA places the compounds in Category 1, there's real access ahead of any final ruling, and that becomes a plausible next step after what just happened in this Advisory Committee. Now, it didn't happen yet. It's probable rather than being completely finished or done. And when we think about these compounding pharmacies, state boards license them, inspect them, discipline them, and states can set requirements that are more restrictive than the federal standard, which is why the state layer is equally as important as this federal layer. So a federal advisory recommendation does not bind a state medical board. A state medical board can decide whether to pursue action against a pharmacy compounding BPC-157 is now weighing a substance that a federal advisory committee recommended for the legal list, which is a completely different decision than it was when maybe a state medical board was looking at this 3, 6, or 9 months ago. My read is that this plays out unevenly state by state. What a pharmacy will prepare over the next year in Texas could look very different or look nothing like what a pharmacy in California touches, and neither tells you where federal rulemaking lands. Not to mention some compounding pharmacies were still making this over the past couple of years and just weighing the legal risk relative to the profit of making the compound or being pursued by the state medical board. So if you or the people around you are already using these compounds, nothing about the legal status drastically changed overnight. It's more of a direction that these compounds may be going in. The vials sold online for research only are the same vials. And, the future of compounding, while we have some indication of what might happen, still may come down to a state-to-state level. Today's episode is less about being in favor of any particular peptides or sourcing any particular peptides. It is a news update breaking down the latest industry announcements and what people need to know if they're interested in accessing these compounds. There's been a lot of misconceptions, whether it's on social media or Reddit threads, and peptides are a popular topic of conversation. It's important to be able to sift through the noise and understand what's actually happening in terms of the legal and regulatory landscape. I'm not anti-peptides. I like peptides, and I think there's a lot of promise in this particular industry, but people have been confused based on the difference between what an FDA advisory committee means versus FDA approval, FDA rulemaking, the Category 1 designation, and interim discretion. And a lot of that has gotten really jumbled on social media to where there's confusions around access, if this is something that's going to be produced tomorrow at a compounding pharmacy, or how this will play out over the next 1 to 2 years. If you're a health and fitness coach and you like being up to date on the most relevant and latest information, understanding what it means from both a biochemical and physiological perspective, being able to answer these questions in real time for your clients and having the research and evidence to back it up, we cover topics like this inside our functional nutrition and metabolism specialization program. You can head over to metabolismschool.com to learn more. If you enjoyed this episode and it cleared up some confusion for you, change your perspective, if it was entertaining or educational, please share it with a friend, and you can support the show by leaving a 5-star rating and review on any major audio platform. If you're catching this on video, like YouTube, for example, give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a new episode where I break down news and industry information just like this. I appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode, and I'll talk to you in the next show.